Okay, so as you hear there, that John's words of wisdom are going to be captured for posterity for people to listen back. So we've always had a great tradition for these lightning talks of starting and finishing on time, because hopefully that will allow and attract people to come back knowing that we don't overrun. This one's going to be no exception. So welcome to you all. It's really great that you've taken the time out for to attend this half-hour slot, and it's even more wonderful that we've got John here, who obviously heads up the research subcommittee for the Newcastle Health Innovation Partners, but today he's talking about what I've known John as, I guess, his first love really, on autoimmune disease. Obviously he's a rheumatologist, a clinical rheumatologist by background, still really passionate about the area. I know that, having talked to him on many occasions about this and the research. So he's going to titillate you in the next 15 minutes about this area that he's so passionate about. Autoimmune disease is a potential cure on the horizon. John, is it? Over to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the opportunity. And actually, this talk's come at quite an interesting time. I think it's very timely. And what I'm going to tell you in the next 15 minutes, maybe a little bit less than that, is we're really in the process of a revolution in the management of diseases in which the immune system attacks our own tissues, or what we call autoimmune diseases. So I'm going to start really by a real, very, very basic sort of explanation of how the immune system works. And actually, I used this almost exactly the same slide in my talk when I first joined Newcastle University 22 years ago. So it is a very old slide. I put a new pathogen in the middle there, though. That's, I think you'll all recognize this, COVID, and it's meant to demonstrate how the immune system will tackle something like a virus. And basically, as you would expect, it's a number of different cells which interact. I call them armies. So there's a general there that's coordinating the immune attack. And there's just 4 cells here. But actually, each one of those cells, we now know through current technologies, probably represents 20 to 30 different cells. And so the immune system is incredibly complicated. And those cells coordinate and attack that invading virus or bacteria or tumor and neutralize it or kill it. But it is complex, it is sophisticated. And so the question then comes about, why doesn't it attack our own tissues? Because we're made of the same building blocks as viruses or bacteria, and indeed our tumors are our own tissues. So it probably doesn't surprise you that there are an equal number of mechanisms to stop us attacking self. So the immune system is incredibly sophisticated to both attack where it's meant to and not attack where it's not meant to. And here I've got one example of there are cells that we call regulatory cells. They're a little bit like policemen, and they try and prevent autoimmune disease by switching off those, that's meant to be a joint there in the middle, switching off the unwanted processes. So it's all complicated. You know, you could liken it to designing a space rocket. There's so many bits and pieces which interact, and if they all go right, then it's fantastic innovation, but there is a potential for them to go wrong. And so we've had this system which has the ability to respond to the outside world of non-self bacteria, viruses, even our own cancers and tumors, but avoiding the capacity to respond to self tissues. And that's the nub of the immune system, really. And there's all sorts of facets to that. So when should it switch on? How long should it switch on for? When should it switch off at the end of a response? What type of immune response do we want? Do we want something that's really inflammatory or just a little bit inflammatory, or perhaps a regulatory response, as I showed you, switching off at the end of the process? So it's all about quality and quantity, and it's this multifaceted, highly sophisticated organ system. As I say, you could liken it to a rocket ship, if you like. Autotoxicus, that's an old-fashioned word for autoimmunity, so the horror of attacking one's own tissues. Why do we get it? Because if we understand why we get these conditions, then maybe we can understand a bit more about how to treat them. So the first thing is genetics, and I call it the luck of the draw. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is just 8 individuals and 10 genes. So the columns are genes and the rows are individuals. Sorry, other way around. The columns are individuals and the rows are genes. So there's 10 different genes. We've got 30,000 genes. And as you probably know, our genes mutate, and some of those mutations are selected. And over the years, our immune system has selected variants mainly to help us fight pathogens, because traditionally, historically, that's what killed humans is infections. And so many of what I've called susceptibility alleles here are really good for the immune system in terms of fighting infections, fighting pathogens, malaria, these very common third world diseases. Our immune system is very good. But of course, once those infections are controlled, either because of antibiotics or vaccination or some other reason, we don't necessarily need those super genes, but they're still there. You can't automatically get rid of them. And now they're a little bit of a danger because they ramp up the immune system a little bit. Going back to the space rocket analogy, somebody might invent a bit of a space rocket which makes it go a little bit faster. That might be great under certain circumstances, but it could all backfire and lead to an explosion under other circumstances. So we're left with these susceptibility alleles, which make our immune systems better in some places, but actually can cause problems. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is, depending on the luck of the draw, you might not inherit any of them, or you might inherit one, or you might inherit a few. And there becomes a critical mass of these so-called single nucleotide polymorphisms or mutations. And if you inherit too many, then you're susceptible to autoimmunity. You don't necessarily get it, but you're poised to get it. And then we have the environment, which you do have some control over. So rheumatoid arthritis is much common in smokers, people with bad teeth who don't look after their teeth, obese people, poor diet, for example. So those environmental factors then work with the genetics to trigger the disease. And we often think of a multi-hit process in terms of developing an autoimmune disease. The thing is, it's always been assumed to be a one-way street, that once you get a disease like rheumatoid arthritis or diabetes, that's it. And the damage is done. And in some ways, it reflects the way we treat these diseases. So when I started off life as a rheumatologist, we would treat rheumatoid very late in its progress. And actually, at that stage, we were just suppressing inflammation. We couldn't prevent damage. Our patients would end up having surgery on their joints. And it was just all too late. Not surprisingly, everybody assumed once a disease was there, you couldn't do anything about it. Think of thyroid autoimmunity or diabetes. You replace the hormone that's missing because the assumption is the tissue's all gone. It's all been damaged. It's a one-way street. We're there. I guess what's happened over the intervening 20 years is we now treat much earlier all of these diseases, particularly diseases like rheumatoid. We have early arthritis clinics and patients come to see us earlier. And it's made us revisit that whole paradigm. So just to kind of recap a little bit, we've got this seesaw of potential self-aggression and what I call self-regulation. So our immune system is poised to attack, but lots of regulatory processes to stop it going wrong when it's recognizing self, and that's health. In autoimmunity, that, as I say, maybe because you inherit a few extra mutations, you smoke, it tips towards self-aggression. And we then give drugs, well, I won't go into what they are, and that kind of rebalances the system and gets back into equilibrium. But the tradition has been, you just got to carry on now. It's like blood pressure, you treat forever. What we're beginning to see in our early arthritis clinic, for example, is that actually, if you treat patients early, about half of them actually can go into what we call remission. So all their symptoms go away, they're back to a normal life, they can go back to work, they can enjoy their family, they can do whatever they like to do. And we've achieved remission. And furthermore, what we're also discovering is about half of those patients, we can stop their treatment and the disease doesn't seem to come back, at least for a significant period of time. So in some patients, we can stop therapy. And if you think about it, what it kind of means is that those regulatory processes are still there. The genes and the smoking have kind of disrupted the system and led to that imbalance, but it doesn't mean that you can't regain that balance. And so it's led to a completely new way of thinking about these diseases, that we can achieve remission if we treat the patients early. And in fact, That's easier. The other thing that's important to recognize is that actually, because we see patients early, we also recognize now that some patients get better before we've even treated them. So the system itself is trying to right itself, if you like. It's trying to correct whatever it is that's gone wrong and get things back into homeostasis. It doesn't happen very often, that spontaneous side of things, but it does happen. And actually, 30 years ago, if I talked about this concept of what we call tolerance, people laughed, actually. They said, how the hell do you expect to achieve that sort of thing in these terrible diseases? But there's now many pharma and biotech companies developing what they call immune reset therapies. They believe this can happen. And it's more likely to be achievable in early disease, but not exclusively. There are examples in late disease with much stronger therapies, I have to say. But it looks like we can achieve this switch off at various disease stages. Taking the whole algorithm one step further, if we can treat early, can we actually prevent? The difficulty about prevention, of course, is how do you know who to approach? But actually, sorry, just to finish that slide, we now believe this whole process is reversible. In terms of prevention, actually, we do know who the patients are, the people are that we need to prevent, because surprisingly, a disease like rheumatoid can take up to 15 years to really develop. And we know that now because we can identify what we call antibodies in the bloodstream up to 15 years before the patient develops a disease. They're completely asymptomatic. This has been found by accident, actually, in various studies. For example, if you give blood in the Netherlands, they always take a blood sample and store it. And so if someone then gets arthritis, they can look back and see when those antibodies appeared. And sometimes it's 15 years. And then in a few years before the disease starts, you get what we call subclinical inflammation, the immune response matures. And if you look in the blood, then you can see that the CRP is going up. There's circulating cytokines. The patient still feels well, but their immune system is maturing. They then go through a phase where if you image the joints, there's definitely inflammation there, but they still generally feel okay, or they might feel a bit tired. And then the whole thing explodes and they get arthritis. So of course, that then begs the question, could we be treating even earlier and preventing that disease altogether? And there's some ethical issues around that. There's lots of questions to be asked, but actually it's happening. So in type 1 diabetes, just a year ago, the FDA approved an antibody. It's to delay the onset of stage 3 diabetes. So these are people, going back to my last figure, it's a bit like people around about this stage. We know they're going to get diabetes, but they haven't got it yet. And so this drug has been approved to give to those people to try and stop them getting diabetes. And without going into a lot of science, this was one such trial where the people in red are the patients who got the people who were asymptomatic but got the treatment, and the people in black were on placebo. The thing to recognize here is that was 14 days of treatment. This is 6 years of follow-up, and in fact, the overall was almost 9 or 10 years of follow-up, at which stage the hazard for getting diabetes after that 14 days is halved. And if you did get diabetes, you had twice as long in health before you got it. And basically, this 14 days of treatment reduced your risk of diabetes by about 50%. And there's similar trials now in rheumatoid with very similar data. The real difficulty, if you like, about this, and I suspect some of you are already asking the question is, are these people going to get diabetes? Is it just delaying? And in fact, if you go back to the FDA, they talk about this as a delaying therapy rather than a preventative therapy. But it may well be that some of these patients will never get diabetes after that treatment. That's the belief. And what we're lacking here is biomarkers. This is actually my last slide. It's another big theme of our lab, that if we could measure the immune state, and that's all those hundreds of cells, and understanding what it is that describes normality, and compare that with somebody with arthritis or diabetes, we might get a feel for which one of these patients had an immune system that after this treatment looked like health rather than disease. And we need to get a handle on that because it would make life much more easy. It may have been that we could have given this treatment regularly every 2 years and prevented diabetes forever, even if one shot didn't do it. And that's where the field is moving. So it's kind of exciting. And that's the title of my talk. It feels like a cure is on the horizon. So The immune system is sophisticated. Sometimes things go wrong, but it may not be a one-way street. And it looks like it is possible to reverse these diseases, at least in the earlier stages. There's now a drug approved to prevent type 1 diabetes. We desperately need biomarkers. It's worth saying one of our NHIP fellows, who I think is on the call, Ken Baker, is very much into this field and trying to identify those biomarkers and understand the patient's perspective on whether they really want to be treated when they're still feeling healthy. So that's it, David. Thank you all for listening, and I hope that was exciting.
John, super, bang on time as well. That's really great. I see Ken's on the call amongst the other numerous attendees, so that's great. John, I'm just, while people are thinking, I can't obviously see, by the way, all of you at all. So if you did want to ask a question, could you put your hand up? Oh, there we are. I can probably see pretty well everyone now, not quite. So you might still want to pop your hand up if you do want to ask a question. John, while everybody's thinking, you know that last slide you showed, which is really interesting, that type 1 diabetes slide. In retrospect, were there any markers that identified the people more likely to go on and get type 1 diabetes as opposed to the people who were disease-free, or at least marked out those who were, you know, going to remain disease-free for longer? Because I guess that's the trick, isn't it? It's kind of based around what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, I think the reason this has come to diabetes first, there's two aspects to your question. The reason it's come to diabetes first is because once they're not patients, that people have got to a particular stage, they will inevitably get diabetes. And that's the first thing. So ethically, it's easy to say, we want to give you this treatment. It may make a difference, but if we don't give you anything, you're going to get diabetes. In rheumatoid, it's not quite the same. You know, our best is about 70% certainty, but there's 30% who might get better anyway. So that's the first thing. But the other aspect of the question is, once you give the treatment, can you pick out the ones that are going to respond? And that's an interesting question, David. It's very perceptive, because it seemed the answer is yes, but not very precisely as yet. But it seems to be, perhaps not surprisingly, that in order to interrupt the immune response, you have to have an active immune response against your pancreas or your islet antigens. And that sounds obvious, but the patients all look the same clinically, and in some they might be a bit further down the line, and their immune response may already be waning. And those patients don't respond so well to therapy. The ones that seem to respond well, and it looks the same in rheumatoid, are the ones who clearly have an aggressive immune response. So you almost need a stronger immune response to switch it off. If it's already switching off itself, your treatment doesn't do so much good, but it doesn't automatically completely switch off. So you get this smoldering disease. In rheumatoid, in one of the most recent studies, which in fact we participated in, patients with lots of autoantibodies in their blood did really well. So traditionally, they're the patients with the worst prognosis. They have loads of autoantibodies. And I think the reason they did really well is the patients who didn't get treatment did really badly. So the ones on placebo just all got rheumatoid within a couple of years or less than that, whereas the ones that got the active treatment stayed disease-free. So there's something about being able to measure that immune state and targeting the people in whom the immune state is most active. And that's a recent recognition, actually. So
interesting. Yeah, no, that I see where I'm thinking of other parallels there, but no, thanks, John. So just wonder, there's quite a varied audience, I suspect. Did anybody want to make any comments or observations? I'm not going to put Ken on the spot because I can't see him, but does anybody? Oh, Ken's actually put his hand up. Anyway, go on, Ken, give us a perspective here.
Well, no, this is a question for John. So a lot of the treatments we've had for rheumatoid arthritis, things like adalimumab, blockbuster drug, biggest grossing drug of all time, given every 2 weeks to patients, and it works well and keeps them in remission, and you can give it to them every 2 weeks for the rest of their life and make quite a bit of money out of doing that if you're a drug company. What do you think? Do you think there really is the passion in pharmaceutical companies to develop a treatment that you can give once or twice maybe, and then prevent the disease from ever happening, but then obviously prevent them from ever wanting your drug again. And do you think that's been I wonder when, obviously the complexity of the system is one barrier and the lack of biomarkers is another, but do you think the pharmaceutical the companies are also perhaps maybe not in their interests in another barrier?
It's an excellent question, Ken. And, we've been through this in rheumatology with drugs like rituximab, which need to be given intermittently. And initially, the company developing rituximab very much against that being used in rheumatoid because they thought it was not going to be a long-term treatment. But I think the nub of this is value-based pricing. You hear these gene therapies which cost $1 million a shot. I guess if a company develops a treatment that can not definitely, but if it just takes, there's two aspects to it. Well, it may be an intermittent treatment, as I suggest with diabetes. So it may be that we can't switch off with just a single treatment. It may be a lifelong treatment, perhaps every 2 years rather than every 2 weeks. So there's something in that one. Or I think it becomes down to value-based pricing. So it may be that if a company comes up with a really safe vaccine, say, and that's the other big area here is vaccination, a bit like the COVID vaccines. You can develop vaccines which switch off rather than switch on. That's very exciting. Then maybe they could charge $1 million for it because that's all the savings, as you say, for the next 30 or 40 years. And, a disease like rheumatoid isn't uncommon. It affects 1 in 200 people. So there has to be some calculation by the economists to say this is what we think it's worth to treat this disease. So I suspect that's where it will end up. So I do think there is because the other side of this coin is a lot of companies have moved away from rheumatoid, for example, because they think the market's flooded, which is a shame. So we're not getting new drugs because they feel there's too many good drugs out there. So it will take a complete new concept to suddenly start spending the money again. And I could imagine 10 drugs with immune reset therapies all competing with one another in this space, for example. So I don't think it's as much of a turn-off, excuse the pun, as you might expect. It's just to do with how you charge for your drugs.
Well, that's an interesting concept and conversation. I'm not sure we've got health economists on the call here, but I mean, I can just imagine it. The big question, John's going to be who pays that £1 million for the big shot that buys the time later on, and who then saves down the line. But yeah, it's an interesting philosophical discussion as well as a practical one. Any other questions for John? I mean, I think this kind of personalized approach, which again, I know, John, you're very passionate about, this is really the future of medicine in general. In my own area, not long back from a big movement disorder congress in Copenhagen. And of course, the dementia field is moving and the degenerative field is moving very much into the sort of vaccine space. And we all know about the new therapies coming through in Alzheimer's. And I can see in future, it's going to be a case of phenotyping people according to protein accumulation and then delivering the relevant vaccines perhaps as a cocktail. It's not a million miles away from what you're describing, certainly on a personalized approach, I guess.
I think Ken's being very modest, actually. I mean, I think the other big area here, certainly in our disease, as I hinted at, is the ethics of it, because it's quite interesting, actually. I've been working in an EU consortium around this area. And we used to call these people at risk for RA, and the patients hated it because they said, well, the people hated it. They said, well, we don't know whether we are at risk and we may not get the disease, and you're trying to prevent it. So we now call it, well, in fact, no, we used to call it pre-RA, that's right. And they said, we don't want to be called pre-RA because we don't know we're going to get it. So in fact, we do call it at risk now, which does describe the situation. But there's still quite a big ethical question because, as I hinted, even with the best tools at the moment, we can only be about 70% certain at a population level that people are going to progress, which of course means that 3 out of 10 aren't going to. And then you're offering them quite potent therapies in some cases to try and prevent that 70% risk. And so Ken's been doing a lot of work with people saying, are you prepared to take that risk? What do you think about this? And it depends a lot on their experience in the family and whether they've seen bad disease before. It's a fascinating area.
Well, I mean, obviously, sounds like we're having a private conversation here. I see Ken looking on. I mean, that's incredible, because believe it or not, just literally a few days ago, I had a conversation with somebody about the way the Alzheimer's field's going. And now if somebody's having an amyloid PET scan done and they're showing as positive amyloid, but they've no symptoms, it's a similar argument about, are you calling them pre-Alzheimer's, and all of the baggage. Can you imagine how that then, and the one thing I would have to say is that actually a lot of this is being, if I'm honest, in the neurodegeneration field at any rate, it's being driven by industry, John.
Yeah.
Obvious reasons. So anyway, I think this is one for us to pick up separately, I think. But I'm just looking around. I'm not seeing any other. Oh, there's a hand up from Anthony or Tony. I'm not sure what you get. Anthony McLean. Go for it, Anthony. You can have the last word here, the last question.
Hey. Yeah, thank you, Professor Isaacs. I was just thinking about your immune armies slide, and obviously we know that there may be pathological cell states that are conserved across different IMIDs, and but there's also the case of maybe stromal cells as well. So maybe in the future, do you see a case where we'd have to target immune cells and stromal cells in combination? Rather than just immune cells.
Thank you. That feels like a bit of a loaded question, because that's the other side of our lab's interests, actually. So we've just been finishing a trial of targeting stromal cells. And in my head, that's why the disease has become irreversible, because we don't have time to go into the science, but we do know that a prolonged immune response often triggers stromal cells to take on a new identity. And they become very important in diseases like rheumatoid, for sure. And at the moment, none of our drugs target those cells. And I guess that's behind your question. So certainly in established disease, I think if we routinely wanted to switch off established disease, we're going to have to target stromal cells as well as the immune system. But I do also think probably in early disease, we should be doing that as well. So it's a great question. It's just we don't have any drugs yet. I think our trial is one of the first ones ever in the world to target those cells in a meaningful way. So watch this space. We just data locked on that trial last week. So it's a great question, and that's the other part. It's not all immunology is what you're saying. There's other parts to these diseases as well, which we need to be aware of. But I think the reason early disease is so susceptible is because at that stage it is all immunology, and we have some fantastic drugs to treat them. So if we can get to the patients early, that's why it makes such a difference.
Great. Well, nice to finish with a really strong question, and thanks for that, Anthony. It's wonderful. So just remains for me to thank John very much indeed for really interesting and exciting talk, John, and also to Beth for organising the thanks, Beth, for organising the talk so flawlessly. So look forward to seeing you all back soon for another lightning talk. Watch this space for news on our next speaker, and see you all around soon, I hope. All right.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, John. Thanks again. Bye now.